Hello everyone, this is your host Roy, and you're listening to a brand new episode of the MetaRoy podcast. Every week on this show, we simplify one aspect of the crypto and Web3 space to move one step closer to our vision of mass adoption of the Web3 ecosystem. Now you might have heard about Central Bank Digital Currencies, which represent a new form of electronic money that, unlike well-known cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin or Ethereum, is issued by central bank of certain countries. Today we have Professor Scott Christianson with us to talk about CBDCs in detail and to understand their pros and cons. Scott is an associate teaching professor of management at Trulaske College of Business, University of Missouri, where his interests are focused on the impact of emerging technology on society and geopolitics. Prior to joining the college, he was a business owner with decades of experience in video conferencing technology, project management, and informational technology. He has worked on hundreds of information technology projects and remains actively involved in informational technology initiatives and startups. Scott, thank you for joining us today, and it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you on this podcast. How are you doing today?
I'm doing very well, very well. Thank you so much for having me. I think this is a great podcast, and I love the way that you dive deep into one area, but make it easy to understand. So I really enjoy listening to your podcast. So it's an honor to be on it.
Thank you. Thank you. And if you're new to this show, do subscribe and follow me on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, pretty much every platform that you get your dose of podcasts on. Before we start though, just a quick disclaimer. The following content is informational only and none of it should be interpreted as financial advice. So please do your own due diligence before making any moves in the crypto space. With that out of the way, let's get started. Scott, let's get right to it. So the topic for today, we are discussing about CBDCs. Can you just tell our audience what CBDCs are? Let's start from there.
I think you did a great job of kind of introducing it already in just a couple sentences, but it is a form of digital currency. So we're familiar with Bitcoin and Ethereum and other currencies that might have specific applications, but it's a digital currency, but instead of being decentralized in the same way that, these cryptocurrencies are, it would be centralized and it would be issued by a central bank. That's the bank that backs up a currency. For example, the federal government here in the U.S. has a central bank that issues dollars, digital dollars to banks and physical dollars. But this would be something that you'd have a wallet on your phone that would kind of give you access to your repository of digital dollars. And outside of any third party like Visa or Venmo or PayPal or any of those types of payment providers.
Got it. So essentially, it's not decentralized. It's controlled by a centralized authority. Like in the US's case, it would be Fed. In the case of India, it would be something like RBI. So essentially, the entire network is controlled by this centralized authority. Is my understanding correct?
Yes, that's correct. And so it's backed by the central government. So there'd be some very different things between a central bank digital currency and a decentralized currency like Bitcoin. Bitcoin is kind of pseudo-anonymous, right? I can create a wallet on my phone. You don't know who that person is, but that has its own dangers, right? If I lose my keys, if I lose my wallet, then my money's gone. And in fact, there's 200 billion US equivalent dollars of assets that have been lost because people simply lost their private keys. And so it wouldn't be quite, there's some dangers with decentralization, right? But a centralized system, it might be more like a traditional financial institution, and then it would be know your customer. So the Federal Reserve would know that that's Scott Christianson that has been issued these digital dollars. And if for some reason I was to lose my wallet, I would be able to go back to the federal government and get some sort of, reconciliation of that.
Got it. In terms of printing new money, for example, Is it the same way as what the Fed does currently, or is there any difference in the way CBDCs are issued?
Yeah. So what's very interesting is right now, if the central bank wants to quote unquote print new money, for example, during the beginning of the pandemic here in the U.S., we received some incentive money, if you will, or some money to help us get by from the government. That went through the private banking system. So it showed up in my private bank account. Well, in the case of a central bank digital currency, they could just airdrop it to my wallet. Okay. And so they could just bypass that entire banking system. This might be very beneficial. Let's say that there's an area where there's a flood. Okay. Well, now, we want to get some money to those people that have experienced this flood and they need emergency aid. Well, now we have to have this complicated system. Instead, we could just say, okay, here's a geofence. We know everybody inside this area. Everybody that's inside this area, we're going to airdrop so much money to their wallet. And so there would be some financial benefits to doing this as terms of being able to generate new money or distribute money in different ways.
Got it. I think the first question that whenever people who are fans of Bitcoin, for that matter, is the question that comes that will CBDCs kind of kill or replace Bitcoin? What do you think will happen in this case?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question because I think there is a portion of the Bitcoin community that's very skeptical of any central bank digital dollar or dollar even. So there's a antagonistic role that the Bitcoin community plays against these centralized banks. So I think they certainly would not want to see that happen. But I think our governments might, right? Because Bitcoin is kind of a Wild West. People that are inexperienced have gotten into it, have lost money. There have been scams around it. So the ability to say, you don't have to use that, we've got this other thing, right? I think is where some folks, at least in the U.S., are going, especially politicians. They want to have an alternative to say this will help the unbanked, and this will be a better alternative to some cryptocurrency that some anonymous person came up with, right?
Absolutely. Another question that frequents these channels is, will stablecoins, for example, which are currently running, so will these be rendered redundant by the introduction of CBDCs? What do you think will happen in that case?
Yeah, I don't know that they will be, but it's an interesting question. And some of the so-called stablecoins in the last couple of weeks have not proven to be that stable because they're algorithmically stable. They're not necessarily backed by dollars, right? And so they were trying to do some math to make them stabilize rather than trying to actually hold assets. So I think we need to have some sort of stable currency if cryptocurrency is going to be a currency. And whether that is a central bank digital currency remains to be seen. But you can also think about currency exchanges, how that might be affected by the development of a central bank digital currency. And there are some governments that are experimenting with this technology right now.
Absolutely. Scott, you already mentioned one example. What are the other ways in which CBDCs will kind of disrupt the existing financial systems?
Well, I think when you start to look at how they might bypass current banks, and I also think that we have to look at the fact that they might be used in different ways depending on the government's wishes, right? So in China, they've been airdropping digital renminbi, their digital currency, to people. And so they have worked out a lot of the technological issues, bypassing entirely any private banks that might exist. But you also have a very authoritarian government. And they also have things like a social credit score. So you can imagine a situation whereby central bank digital currencies could be more than just something like Bitcoin, which is, just Bitcoin, right? It's an asset. Well, think about Ethereum, where you have smart contracts. Okay, that's more like a currency, right? And that combines the currency with the ability to do smart contracts. Well, now we could start to put a governor on behavior. So Scott goes out and buys his first 6 beers are $5 each. Oh, wait a second. He's using his digital wallet to buy another 5 beers. We don't want that. So we're going to increase the price of those. We're going to inflict some financial pain if he wants to continue to, drink down these beers. So there's other ways that you could start to see a melding of the fiscal policy or monetary policy along with social policy or even international policy.
Absolutely. You mentioned earlier that with the introduction of CBDCs, the unbanked will be brought within the lines of financial inclusion which they were earlier missing out on, right? So will that actually happen? Have you seen some instances where introduction of CBDCs?
I've seen a lot of governments talk about that, but I have yet to see it. There's still the need to be a know your customer. Okay, so to identify yourself. So we have homeless people here in my town. I don't know that they could get a hold of their birth certificate very easily or remember what their social security number is. So whether this would truly help the unbanked, I think remains to be seen. We know that with Bitcoin or Ripple or any number of other cryptocurrencies, we can very quickly create a wallet for that person and they have that account. Whether we could do the same for central bank digital currencies, I think is somewhat in question.
Correct.
Now, certainly you wouldn't have the things like a bank might have a minimum fee or certain other fines or something if you have an overdraft. So there could be some ways that people that are unbanked right now would have greater access.
Got it. This is a problem. Maybe it might be relevant to most of India because black money, for example, is a big problem, right? So people hiding money outside of the country and probably using it in Swiss banks or something like that. So do you think introduction of CBDCs will lead to this kind of transparency in the entire system?
So that's something that I think could have a benefit in a lot of ways. And there's been a lot of talk about even using just cryptocurrencies. So even using some sort of stable coin or other coin to track transactions within an institution. So for example, I work in higher education. So I'm a professor in the business department. My students pay tuition. Well, if they paid tuition with something like a central bank digital currency, and we use that throughout our system, they could see where their dollars are going. Oh, is this going to Professor Christianson and the classroom I'm in? Or is this going to some administrator somewhere? Or is this going out to some other, pet project that the president of the university has? So where is my money really going? So I think it could lead to more accountability, more traceability. And that once again kind of gets into cultural aspects, what's my right to do what I want with my money? So maybe I don't like that as much either.
Got it. Another thing and this is one thing that Bitcoin is famous for, is facilitating cross-border payments, right? And international settlements. So will CBDCs be able to change anything, or what do you think will be the new normal when CBDCs are introduced?
Yeah, I think that's going to be kind of remain to be seen, right? So right now you can go to the Bahamas and you can change your money into the digital sand dollar, and you can have a wallet on your phone. You can spend it there while you're in the Bahamas. Are you going to be able to spend that or use that when you get back here? Probably not, right? And in fact, the U.S. may not want you to be doing that. For example, we may not want you to be transacting in digital renminbi or in the, Russian ruble or something else because of, our international relations. So we may not, we may have governments that are saying, no, we're not going to allow these types of applications to cross borders. And so I think it's going to introduce a whole set of other problems. Now, however, I will say that when we start to look at cross-border transactions, right now we have to use the SWIFT network, right? So that's by and large the network that is used. So let's say that I wanted to send you $10 million for something. Well, that might take 20 days to settle, and it might cost me tens of thousands of dollars to do it, right, for that wire transfer fee. Well, you and I know that we can do that with Bitcoin. It'll probably settle in 10 minutes, something like that.
Exactly.
And we're going to pay a couple $100 or less, right, to settle that transaction. In fact, that has been done. If you look at any of the Bitcoin blockchain ledgers, I was doing this with my students 2 days ago, and we saw a transaction for $29 million that went through. And we could see, that it settled within just a few minutes, and we could see exactly what the fee was. So I think central bank digital currencies, one of the reasons why many central banks are looking at this is they see that the SWIFT network is old and antiquated, and there needs to be a better way to transfer money across borders. I think there's still a lot of technical as well as policy issues that need to get worked out, but I think that's one of the main drivers. So if you're really interested in this topic, I would also recommend the Bank of International Settlements in Basel, Switzerland. Has a lot of really good research papers. So they are the ones that kind of help with this interbank settlement, and is at the forefront of the research on central bank digital currencies.
Got it. I will definitely check that out. So a follow-up question to that is, what happens to currency exchanges? Will they completely be replaced by something like smart contracts, or do you still see them existing in some way or the other?
Yeah, it's interesting to think about that because it varies very much country by country. So central bank digital currencies, I think, are going to lead to, well, some people believe it's going to lead to more competition for reserve currencies. So the U.S. dollar has enjoyed a great benefit by essentially being the currency that is used to settle transactions. So even if you're in countries that are not using the U.S. dollar as their own currency, so you were making a transaction between India and South Africa, that transaction might still get settled in U.S. dollars. So a lot of people are looking at, well, could we have a digital currency that might be the currency that runs on the backbone, right? So that we used to even have a third option here, which is a different digital currency that would be used for international settlements. In much the same way Ripple is kind of the cryptocurrency that's used for cross-border transactions a lot now.
Got it. Obviously, there would be some potential risks as well associated with CBDCs, right? So what do you think could be some of those risks that we should be aware about?
Well, I think I'm worried about what I've already mentioned, and that is how authoritarian governments could use that to track transactions, to track people, to say, well, Scott is not of the right political party, and so therefore we want to change the way his programmable money works. Okay. And so we really need to think about central bank digital currencies as not just one way to have a digital dollar or digital currency, but also a way to really have programmable money. Okay. You could even make money expire. Okay, so let's say that I did get an airdrop of some money to help with relief in my area, but I was largely unaffected. The flood didn't come to my house. I've still got a good job. I'm doing fine. Well, if I don't use that money in a little while, it could expire. So that might be a really good thing, right? So that it's kind of going to the people who need it, or go to the people that will use it in the local economy to stimulate the local economy. At the same time, we can have, that same information, that programmable money, act in different ways. So we don't want Scott to contribute to the opposing political party. When he tries to send that money to them, it doesn't work or something like that. So I think this is kind of something we might want to slow down a little bit on, especially thinking about how it could be abused, because too often we deploy technologies and then we find out how they're abused later on, right?
Absolutely. What do you think, for example, governments will need to build some sort of infrastructure to actually support CBDCs, right? So what are the frameworks that you think will be critical for the government to build to kind of support this new system?
Yeah, so there's a couple different kind of models. One is just a wholesale central bank digital currency, and that would be only used between banks for settling transactions with their central government. Okay, so that could be one way that it's done. So for the consumer, for you and I, it wouldn't change at all. It would just be a more efficient way for banks to settle their transactions between different banks. So that's called a wholesale central bank digital currency. A retail central bank digital currency would be one like we've described here, where you would have a wallet and you would have your money in that wallet, or some portion of your money in your wallet, just the way that you carry a portion of your money in your regular physical wallet. In that case, you would probably not, you could either be interacting directly with the central government, such as the kind of China model, okay, or you might be interacting through some intermediary. Okay, so that was some payment service provider that would kind of hold that wallet in a custodial fashion, in much the same way a lot of exchanges do, right? So I can go on, here in the US, Coinbase is very popular. I can go on Coinbase and I can have it on my phone, but if I lose my phone, they still have the custodial wallet. They still have my money stored up there. So we could see that a lot of companies are looking to do that. And you can see why Visa and all sorts of Chase Bank and CITI and all these other large banks would not want to see a direct central bank digital currency, because that bypasses them. Right. And so in countries that have established large banks, I don't think we're going to see that just bypassing those banks. Right. They're too powerful politically. It's also interesting. I have a couple students that are from some very small countries in the Caribbean. And they don't have their own currency because, if you got an island that's 30,000 people, you can't make that investment to have a secure currency. So you might use the British pound, you might use the US dollar, and that's what you have to use for your currency. And now it's kind of interesting because some of those countries are looking at, well, could we issue our own digital dollar? And in fact, the Eastern Bank of the Caribbean is a central bank that is used by a number of different Caribbean countries, is looking at doing that. So now Grenada could have its own digital dollar, right? And there would be an exchange, and they would have the benefits of having their own currency, being able to issue their own currency to their people, helping them control inflation or deflation and other aspects of their currency system. Whereas right now, they're really dependent on other countries just because they don't have the ability to put the budget towards making a secure dollar, right?
Absolutely. Speaking of smaller countries, for example, El Salvador has already made Bitcoin as legal tender, right? So do you think El Salvador will ever move towards a CBDC model, or they will just continue to be using Bitcoin as a legal tender?
Well, a lot of it is driven by the personality of the president there, who, shall we say, is an interesting character. I think that that's probably a poor idea for a country because, as we know, Bitcoin is very volatile. In fact, I got out of most of my cryptocurrency investments back in 2017, 5 years ago, because I just couldn't stand the volatility, right? And we don't really want volatility in the things that we're buying, our groceries with. Or our clothes or something like that. We don't want to find that all of a sudden, the amount that we got paid in our salary is not going to cover our rent, right? So I think that was probably a little too early. And I think that that might not work out so well. I think they probably would have been better off pursuing something like a central bank digital currency. But I would also say that, countries that are undergoing a lot of financial turmoil, they have more incentive to explore these different options. I tell my students, I said, if I was in Venezuela and I got paid, or maybe even Sri Lanka, right? So I got paid for being a professor, I would take that money and buy a toaster, because the toaster is going to hold, or a tea kettle, because the tea kettle is going to hold value more than the dollar will in my country. Okay. So if you're in Sri Lanka, you'd probably be better off as soon as you got your salary to go and buy a bunch of tea kettles, right? Because they're going to hold value, whereas the money there is not. So That's you have to also understand that some of these countries are very desperate to find some alternative because of the mismanagement within their own country. So that's unfortunate, and it's a really it's a tragedy for the people that are going through that.
Absolutely. So when we are building blockchain-based systems and especially smart contract and programmable money, right? So already developers are building on the Ethereum system or any other smart contract platforms. What would be some incentives that the government could use for developers to kind of shift and get these developers to build on CBDC based blockchains?
I think that a lot of that incentive is going to come from the big accounting firms. So KPMG, EY, these big five accounting firms, as they're sometimes referred to, because, blockchain has some interesting properties in that we generally consider it to be an immutable ledger. Once something is written to it, it can't be rewritten. Well, that, we think about the implications for accounting. Okay, you can't have that type of fraud going on. So you don't have to do the reconciliation of records. So I actually think that you're going to see corporations looking to their accounting firms and to their federal government to say, boy, I could save a lot of money with accounting if we have a central bank digital currency and we didn't have to have, we could actually have these smart contracts issued. So every time Procter & Gamble ships some new, we have a Procter & Gamble's big manufacturing company here, and we have a big retailer called Walmart, which I'm sure everybody's heard of. And they, every time they ship some new product to Walmart, as soon as that truck comes in, the smart contract executes and pays Procter & Gamble, right? So you don't have all those contracts going on. So for supply chain, I think that's where we're going to see the driving factors. Is actually it's going to be the corporations that are going to say, hey, we want to have smart contracts too. Okay. We want to be able to do things quickly throughout our supply chain with these smart contracts. I think Ethereum, I think that's one that I'm as bullish on, as we say. So that would be the one that I'm most interested in, especially as they move to a proof of stake because of that smart contract ability. And I do think, it's going to stabilize. The price of that Ethereum will stabilize. And then you can start to see these really interesting applications, right? And once we have that, I think that's going to be, that's going to really change the world a lot. And I think that we're then going to start to see these big corporations going, hey, if Scott and Roy can have a smart contract, why can't I have a smart contract, right? And so that's where I think we'll see the driving force.
Absolutely. I hope so. That happens soon enough. Can't wait for that. But for example, right now we are in a bear market and it's literally being called crypto winter. Do you think we are in a crypto winter, or what do you think about the current state and where do you think we'll be going in the future?
Yeah, so technologies typically will go through kind of a hype cycle. They get overhyped, right? And then we find out that, Bitcoin, at least, it's not really that functional as a currency. It's a wildly fluctuating asset that people are, speculating on, a speculative asset. And so we kind of entered this trough of disappointment. And then typically you see this this slope of productivity where we start to figure out real world applications. And you can look at all sorts of technologies that have gone through this. And so I think in a lot of ways we're seeing that with Bitcoin, where people saw it more as a get rich scheme and not really a decentralized store of value, which is what the intention was. So if you actually look at the ledger, you find that a lot of it is fairly centralized, right? And a lot of people bought it on credit, so they leveraged. And so what happens when something goes down? Well, that means that you it's not called a margin call, but you essentially have to pay off your debt, right? So then you get a lot of sell off, and that adds to the volatility. So I think when you look at the bear market, if you will, I think we have to realize that Bitcoin is not being used for the kind of Web 3.0 applications that probably you and I are focused on. It has been used for highly speculative gains by sometimes multi-billionaires already. So that has not really helped, the small unbanked person being able to use this as a viable store of value. So I think that in some ways Bitcoin has been misused. And so we're seeing the consequences of that. That doesn't make it a bad idea.
Absolutely. Scott, you've been researching on blockchain for a while now. And what do you think are the most interesting applications in the future that you can foresee with your research?
So with just blockchain in general, I think that there's some very interesting applications in supply chain. So being able to track, for example, drugs, I think in the US, that's going to be the first big wide-scale application of blockchain, because we've had a real problem with what we call opioids. So these are narcotics that people have become addicted to. And it turns out that they were able to get these through the prescription system in ways that they shouldn't have been able to. But now our federal government has said you have to be able to pick up a pill bottle and be able to know, where did this come from? How did this get into this patient's hands? Okay. And on the other end of the supply chain, you have to be able to say, where are these pills going? Now, we don't have to identify they're going to Scott, but if there's 10,000 times the normal dose is going to one patient, we better find out why. Okay. So I think that's going to be one of the interesting ones. Supply chain in some ways is very antiquated. And shipping, I think we're going to see a lot of things go on the blockchain because it would allow this kind of common database that everybody could share, have some insight into. Parts of it could be anonymous, parts of it could not be anonymous. And so that's really where I've kind of been focusing lately, is on supply chain. I'm sure there's many others that I have not, that may be much better, that I've not explored, but you can only do so much in a day, right?
Absolutely. Scott, as a message for the audience of the MetaRoy podcast, if you had to suggest some good resources for people to learn about blockchain, to learn about CBDCs in general, what would you suggest those to be?
Yeah. So I actually have a list of resources I'll send to you. Could link in the podcast, and it includes the Bank of International Settlements. So if you really want to geek out on this and really see what governments are doing, and where kind of the direction of these central banks is. And it used to be very negative about central bank digital currencies, but now it's turned very positive because a lot of bankers are seeing the benefits. And then I would say just start to get involved in some of the forums that are out there, listen to podcasts like this, and, dabble in it a little bit, start to understand it. Be a little bit careful, because you can sometimes think that, oh my gosh, all the world is nothing but cryptocurrencies. Okay. Because there's just such a huge amount of information out there. Right. But realize that this may be something that we are fully experiencing or fully becomes productive many years in the future. Okay. So don't get caught up in that hype cycle, is kind of my advice. And I often get asked, well, should I be invested in this? And I say, this is a quote that I'm stealing from someone else, but Andreas Antonopoulos has been very big in Bitcoin, and he sometimes says, investing in cryptocurrencies is like putting a little bit of curry on your dinner tonight. Okay. If you put a little bit of curry on your dinner tonight, that makes it kind of interesting. That's kind of exciting. There's something new there, right? Okay. If you put an entire cup of curry on your dinner tonight, it's going to give you indigestion, right? So don't go too far in, right? So experiment a little bit, maybe take a small amount of money that you can afford to lose and start to see what these smart contracts are like. Maybe buy an NFT, maybe buy something just to see how some of this works. And that gives you a little bit better understanding of where things might be headed.
Absolutely.
We have to the north is Canada, and one of the most famous hockey players there, Wayne Gretzky, always said, I skate not to where the hockey puck is, but to where it's going to be. Right. And so you want to be thinking about where's this all going? Where are these currencies going? And so that allows you to get a little bit more knowledge and see where that hockey puck is going to be, so that you're ready to hit it when you need to.
Absolutely. I agree with you. Scott, what is the best way that our listeners, and especially those who are interested in research, what is the best way to connect with you online?
Yeah, so you can find me at my website. It's christiansonjs.com, but I also have a newsletter where I share different resources and things I'm reading. I got off of Facebook quite a while ago because I didn't like the company, so I started this little newsletter, and it's been a lot of fun. It's profcnews.com, so profcnews.com, and you can look at the back issues there, and I share some resources. For example, I invented something called a blockchain game to teach people about blockchain. So this will help you teach your mother and your father and your aunt about blockchain. And I just got some colleagues in Germany and Italy just sent me translations into those languages. So I'm going to be sharing that out in the next newsletter.
Awesome. And all the resources that Scott will be sharing, you can find it in the show notes or in the description based on where you're hearing this podcast. So all these links, you can check those out and you can connect with Scott directly. On that note, Scott, it was an honor having you on the MetaRoy podcast, and it was great learning about CBDCs and blockchain in such detail and comparing the pros and cons of this amazing technological innovation, right? So whether countries or not get it right, only time will tell. But thank you for taking the time to share these insights and to educate our audience, and obviously taking the time to speak with us. And I wish you all the best.
Well, thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.